Hello, dear listeners, and welcome again to JOSPT Asks, the weekly chat where you, the audience, get your questions answered. I'm Claire Ardern, the Editor-in-Chief of JOSPT, and it's really great to be chatting with you again this week. Today, we're in for a treat. We've got not one, but two runners who are also physiotherapists joining us on JOSPT Asks. Dr. Chris Napier from the University of British Columbia and Restore Physiotherapy in Vancouver will be answering all of your questions about the science of running. And asking the questions today is Paul Blasey, also from Restore Physiotherapy and the University of British Columbia. For those of you who don't know, Paul is the driving force of JOSPT social media, and it's a real pleasure to have both of you on the show today. Welcome to JOSPT Asks.
Thank you for the intro, Claire.
So as Claire mentioned, I've been looking after the social media for JOSPT now since July last year, and hopefully you're all enjoying the more interactive forum that we're hopefully providing for everyone. And thanks to Claire for starting up JOSPT Asks last month. It seems to be going really well, and I hope that you're all enjoying it and that you're going to enjoy today's session as well. So just to add in, Chris was one of the lead organisers for last year's World Congress of Sport Physiotherapy with Sport Physio Canada. He also works for Athletics Canada, and I believe was meant to go to Tokyo this year, as we now know, unfortunately cancelled. And he recently published his new book, The Science of Running, which I have here, and I can highly recommend. It's one of the most visually appealing books I've seen about running recently. So I definitely give that a look if you're into that sort of thing. So how's it been going with the book, Chris?
Yeah, good, thanks. It's been getting out there. I think there's been interest because a lot of new runners a lot of new people are taking up running right now, given the current COVID-19 restrictions. And so I think there's been some interest in a book like this because it really does cater to a lot of newbies who are looking for a little bit more guidance on how to train and how to follow a running program. So I think it's been good in that way. And then it's also, I think, a good resource for clinicians to be using with patients. Again, as you mentioned, the graphics are really nice in it. So it's been nice to be able to share some of that. Even myself, doing some of the telehealth appointments right now, I've been using that a fair bit to send to patients.
Awesome. So I know that obviously the basis that we wanted to start on today was to talk about your PhD to some extent in the Gait retraining. So we're going to go to some of the questions that people had on Slido, if that's okay. And the first question that I thought would be useful to answer is, when do you consider it appropriate to start altering someone's gait pattern?
Yeah, so I mean, I use Gait retraining just like I use anything else. It's just another tool in the toolkit. I'm not looking to change everyone who comes into the clinic, and I'm not also looking for some ideal running form that everyone should be aspiring to. So, I use it if I think I can link, the reason that they're in the clinic, the pain that they're experiencing, to the way they're running. And then I'll use it as one tool to treat that. So if I think that, playing around with their running form, whether it's their cadence or some of the kinematics, if I think that that's going to influence their mechanics or their pain, then I'll use it. I rarely use it to prevent injury. I think part of it is that in the clinical context, you're usually seeing someone with an injury already, so that's not really the aim. But there are times when I will use it to prevent injury, or with the idea of reducing the risk of injury. And it's usually more like with those new runners or runners who are looking to really increase their mileage. If I see something in their running form that I'm concerned about, whether it's a really low cadence or a very narrow step width, I'll use it more to kind of guide them from a coaching perspective, and with the idea that we can hopefully improve their running efficiency, as well as reduce their risk of injury.
Cool. I think that's really important that you said something there, that not everyone will have the perfect running form, and the fact that that doesn't exist, I think, is something that the audience probably needs to remember, because I'll quite often have people come in, myself, who will say, oh, I want to run like Kipchoge, and I say to them, well, you're not Kipchoge, so that's not really the way you want to run. So what you said there about, you know, we're not trying to restore everyone perfect, I think that was a great summary, actually.
Yeah, and I mean, Kipchoge is an interesting example, because I think if anyone does have what looks like an ideal running form, it's probably him. But you can also, you know, find others who have been at the very top of the field, you know, like Haile Gebrselassie, for instance, who I don't think you would say has a perfect running form. And so I think it's important to remember that people can do well with a running form that doesn't necessarily look like Kipchoge.
Yeah, I like to use Paula Radcliffe with the head bob as a good example, as another one. So, so just getting into the mechanics of how you would actually go about an assessment. How do you assess someone's running form in the clinic?
Yeah, so I have, as you know, Paul, I've got a treadmill in our clinic room, and I use an iPad for my video assessment. Really what we're looking to do when we're doing a running gait assessment is we're looking at kinematics, or sort of the way the body moves, and kinetics, which are the forces on the body as a result of the interaction with the ground, and with the internal muscle forces. So those are the main things that we're looking at. Kinematics we can assess quite well with just the slow motion video on an iPad or an iPhone. You can see really well moment of initial contact, toe off, and break it down frame by frame. And then you can use an app, something like Kinovea works really well to be able to draw on angles and compare you know, side to side videos, so you can look at you know, before and after an intervention if you like. So you can do quite a bit in the clinic to look at things kinematically, and a lot of those 2D video analyses have been shown to be quite reliable and valid when using them. And some of mainly the studies that have come out of Bart Dingenen's lab in Belgium are really good to look at, because he's done a good job of showing what angles and kinematics can be measured just using a simple 2D video with an iPad. He's got some really nice infographics that display that as well. Kinetics are a little more difficult to measure. You know, the gold standard is a force light treadmill, which very, very few clinics in the world would have access to, because they're $100,000 plus. What I use more now in the clinic is wearables, and that's just, obviously I'm doing research in wearables right now, so I have access to some of those. But I think we're going to see more and more access to those wearables in a clinical context. You can use, there's some good consumer grade wearables out there right now that you can use, such as RunScribe. I also use an insole embedded IMU from a local company here in Vancouver called Antigua. And those can, you can insert them into the shoe, and you can measure impacts that are a result of the ground reaction force using an accelerometer. And they're in the process of developing sort of a good clinical report, I guess you could say. And RunScribe already has something like that as well. That works quite well in a clinical context. You can use it to display immediately after the runners finish their analysis. You can look at asymmetries, you can look at some of those impact forces, and pick up on things right away. And it's easy to translate that to the patient in front of you. So yeah, that's mainly what I'm using right now, and I'm sure that there's going to be other wearables that come out over the next few years as well that are really aimed at the clinician, as opposed to sort of researchers or the sort of average consumer runner.
I might come back to the wearables in a little bit and just ask you a little bit more about those and about the kinetic side of things. But just to go back to the kinematics, someone actually did ask us about hip adduction and things like that. So I'm presuming that's something that you would be interested in when you're taking a video, and that you mentioned that you're using angles to measure the joint angle at the knee potentially or at the hip. Do you consider that there's an important number that you need to reduce it by, or do you worry too much about the actual numbers that you get when you take that score or measure that angle?
That's a good question. So, when we're doing research, we need to have these numbers, these objective values that we compare between groups and, those who have pain, those who don't, that sort of thing. On that topic of hip adduction angle, Brad Neal's work with patellofemoral pain is really probably the go-to piece for that. And he showed that increased hip adduction was a risk factor for patellofemoral pain. In the clinical context, I'm not so worried about those numbers. Because I'm not sure that I can reliably distinguish a few degrees of hip adduction. And we have to remember that when we're looking at that frontal plane, we're not just seeing hip adduction, we're seeing a measure of internal rotation. So we're looking at like a dynamic valgus motion, which is a three-dimensional motion. That's one of those measures that we have to be careful about assuming in the 2D context. So what I look for in the clinical analysis is how close their knees are together. And you can see this from behind probably a bit better. But if there is space between the knees versus if the knees are kind of coming together through that mid-stance portion, I'll look at that. And if there's reason to think that that's linked to their pain, if they're having patellofemoral pain, for instance, or IT band pain, then that's what I will cue them on. And so I don't cue them on hip adduction per se. I don't tell them that they need to reduce their hip adduction. In the clinic, it's much easier to draw attention to that knee window. So how much space is between the knees, and then get them to think about running with their knees apart to increase their step width, which will in turn then reduce their hip adduction.
So it's a little bit more of a symptom modification approach and just seeing if we can change those symptoms that they're getting with, say, the knee pain.
Yeah, I think that's key. And, a lot of sort of trial and error in the clinic, if you can get them to reduce their pain from an intervention, from giving them a cue, that's going to be powerful. And I think you've got more buy-in from the patient, and they're going to more likely try to work on that when they leave the clinic.
Awesome. So just bringing it up to what we're going through at the moment, obviously we're currently stuck indoors in most countries around the world, and even if we are lucky enough to be able to get out and go for a run, we're still not able to actually have contact with most of our patients. Have you been able to adapt the assessment to telehealth?
Yeah, just starting on that really. I've been doing telehealth now for a couple of weeks, and I think people are still trying to figure out how that all works, both the physios and the patients. With the so I mentioned I can show you the Tikka Insoles that I use. Paul, you're familiar with these. But essentially these are insoles that you just insert into the shoes. You just usually take out the insoles in the shoe. They're embedded here with an IMU, which you can take off, and you can see how thin that IMU is. That just goes underneath the foot. And this will give you, there's an accelerometer and a gyroscope in those, so you can get some good data from those. So I'm in the process of working with them to see if we can use that to do some remote monitoring of running. So I can, the aim is to mail those out to patients and get them to go out for a run, or keep them for a week and go for several runs, maybe try some different cues in them while they're out on their runs, or go onto different surfaces or different speeds, depending on the needs of the patient. And then I can access all of that data online. So that's something that I'm sort of toying around with right now. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but that's the plan. I've already mentioned that the RunScribe pods are also easy to do with that, and some people have been doing that for a while, using the pods and mailing them out to people who can't come in for an assessment. So I think there's actually some advantage to that, because we talk about these lab assessments as not always being really truly valid sometimes to how people run naturally outdoors. If someone's running on the trails all the time, coming into a clinic or a lab and running on a treadmill may not be an accurate representation of how they normally run. And so, the nice thing about using wearables is we can just say, go and do what you normally do. We can track them for a week or 2 weeks and see what happens. And so, in a way, it's an opportunity to really push that side of things, and maybe that's where we'll go more with this, as opposed to the in-clinic assessments.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the things you tend to see when someone runs on the treadmill is, if they do tend to overstride, they find that they can't do it on the treadmill because they hit that bit at the front, the plastic section, and therefore they'll actually chop their stride, and they'll look better on the treadmill than they will outdoors. So having the ability to test in the field does feel like that's a real big win. And as you mentioned, I have had a chance to play with those myself. Which of the metrics that you're getting, or the kinetic variables, do you consider to be the most important when we're looking at these wearables?
Yeah, so we're still doing some validation work on these, but for me, the asymmetries in the accelerations, the vertical and resultant accelerations, is probably the most important. And I can tell you sort of a personal story. Is I had a tibial stress fracture over the winter this year when I was training for a marathon, which I didn't end up doing. And then as I came back after taking 5 or 6 weeks off of running, I used these to ease back into my training. And I started off with quite a noted asymmetry in my force profile. About 20% more loading on my uninjured leg when I started increasing my training. And so for me, it sort of flagged that I should be really careful here about increasing my mileage until I got that sorted out. And with time and sort of gradually building up my mileage, that came down, and now it's down around 1 or 2%. And this is after probably 3 months of returning. But it's something that I could monitor over that time, and if I saw it sort of shoot up, then I know that I was maybe overdoing it and needed to back off a little bit. So I think for me, the acceleration profile and especially the asymmetry can be really helpful when you're dealing with someone who's coming back from an injury, maybe on a return to run program. And then depending on the condition, I mean, we're not going to be able to tell with these insoles what's happening kinematically per se. We're not going to be able to see if they're running with increased hip adduction, for example. So we're somewhat limited there to mainly looking at the forces at play. But I always like to say that it's really the forces that cause the injury. So I think we can see a lot here, and if we can get a snapshot of how they run, if they can take one video of them running outdoors or on a treadmill, whatever they have access to, and send that along with the data from these, then I think we can put together a bit of a picture.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, actually. And as you know, I don't want to get in too much to the tale of woe that us runners seem to be constantly injured in one way or another. And you being a 2:33 marathon man, was it? And me being a 2:39, and both of us, I think, in the past year and a half have had reasonably serious injuries like a stress fracture and stuff like that. And I think that even though we know what to do, I do think that's sort of important to acknowledge that injuries are part of running just because of the extent of the forces that we go through. And so being able to quantify those, I think, is quite important. And hopefully the wearables are going to give us a way to do that. But,
yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think, we may see these kind of become more commonplace, like, your GPS wristwatches have, most runners now run with the GPS wristwatch. They have access to pace, heart rate, that sort of thing for every run. And they can track that data over time. Whereas, 10, 15, 20 years ago, people just ran with a stopwatch essentially. And I think we may start to see these become more prolific in maybe more serious runners to be able to track different metrics of load over time. And I think, just even the asymmetry, I'll go back to my case in the fall when I was training. 100% my injury was because I ignored it and didn't take my own advice and ran through pain. I was limping most runs, but if I had something, if I was using these at the time and I had something every run that showed me that I was loading more and more on one side than the other, having that objective metric there might have been something that I paid attention to more than just my own feelings, which I can easily sort of persuade. So I think that is something that in the future may be a good tool to have.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch for that. I think mine showed a 13% asymmetry, so it was definitely a motivation to dial back down on the strength and conditioning program in the rehab and try and get that right, which most of us runners sort of tend to skimp on as soon as we can get back out the door. I know that we do tend to get back out there and just try and get at it again, regardless of whether we're ready or not. So that's definitely a good metric. So you did mention there about GPS watches and things. Do you think that for those of us who, or for a new starter, some of the people who maybe have just started running because of the isolation and that's their only way of getting some physical activity, do you think GPS is a good way of tracking their load, or do you think we do need to be more sophisticated than just using a Garmin or Strava?
Yeah, so again, good question. I think we just I just had a study in press right now, a paper in press with Journal of Athletic Training, should be out fairly soon in print, where we looked at tracking things like minutes run and cumulative shock and number of steps. And then we compared those metrics to tracking with an RPE measure added in, so a session RPE, and to monitor that internal and external load. And what we found when we looked at changes from week to week, for instance, if we had people who increased the number of minutes they ran from week 1 to week 2, they may have increased by 10%. And I thought they were sort of abiding by the so-called 10% rule. When we looked at adding in session RPE to that value, and so giving more of a training load metric, it completely changed. And we saw people running 30, 50, 60% more between weeks when you added in that internal load metric. And we also saw that with some runners, looking at that cumulative shock value was also made a very different picture. And I think the idea there was that some runners might run on different surfaces or vary their training in ways that is a more sensitive measure of external load than minutes. And so essentially what we determined was that for most runners, just having a external load value like time, which is very easy to measure without a GPS watch, and using a session RPE value and multiplying those two together to give you a training load metric was probably good enough. But in other runners, perhaps who have a bit more variation in their training and their training surfaces, you may want to, if you have access to it, use something like cumulative shock for your runs, and also multiply that by your session RPE. But I think we're hoping to do some more work in that area to see where that is more applicable.
Yeah, I mean, have you done any work at the moment to evaluate the validity and reliability of the devices that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so we did do a study looking at the validity and reliability of the Run Scribe and the Tikka Insoles, and we're working on that data right now. Working on that with Rich Willie in Montana, and so we're hoping to have that out soon, so we can kind of move forward with that.
Yeah, so I think probably the main message at the moment then is times RPE is probably our best measure for those who are starting out, and then hopefully as we go on, we might be able to get a little bit more sophisticated with some of the wearables and in looking at shock, as you said.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so. I'm working on some stuff with Max Paquette in Memphis, Tennessee, on that, and we've actually got a paper coming out soon in JOSPT as well, an editorial about how to best monitor training load in runners, how to best quantify that. That should be out fairly soon, and that that looks at different ways to do it in runners. And I think for most runners, using something simple like minutes and RPE is completely good enough. Where you may want to get more specific, as I said, is with runners who maybe have a bit more variation in the training, or with runners that you're concerned about, previous injuries where you may want to monitor that. So someone who maybe is coming back from a tibial stress fracture, for instance, or some sort of loading injury like that, where you maybe want to monitor them a bit more closely because that loading may be not picked up when you're looking at just minutes, and so you need something like shock or impact to be able to measure that.
Awesome. So just coming back to the retraining process, did you use anything with yourself when you were coming back from injury? Did you change any of your own gait parameters?
So I just, I monitored my my cadence. I found that, and I found this before, that when you're coming back, before you sort of get your coordination back to running, you tend to kind of lope along, you fatigue a little bit earlier, and when you fatigue, perhaps you tend to try and reach a bit more with your stride. So I know that from experience, and I think I just paid a little more attention to my cadence, which is normally fairly high anyway, and I'm familiar with where I usually am with that. And so I paid attention to that, especially as I fatigued. And otherwise, I really focused on strength this time in my return to run. I joined up at the gym, which I had never done before, and I really focused on loading heavy and working especially on lower leg strength.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's probably one of the messages that a lot of people neglect. A lot of runners I'll see, they'll do body weight exercises, 2 sets of 16, assuming that they need endurance, and they really do neglect that heavy, slow load. That I know someone had actually asked on Slido, do you incorporate that into your rehab with runners? Yeah, definitely, and it's something I do more and more these days. And it's very much the load heavy, slow, and try and build that capacity, especially in the tendons, because running is a risk factor for tendon injuries, especially Achilles tendon. And if we can increase the capacity of those tendons to manage the loads we place on them, then you're going to be hopefully preventing injury and helping to rehab from any sort of niggling injuries that are going on, especially with the higher mileage runners. Have you got any favorite exercises that you tend to prescribe?
Yeah, so big fan of the slow eccentric heel drop, and I like to emphasize the seated version of that to bias towards the soleus muscle, and so you may actually be able to find that in my book there if you flip through. I've got a lot of these in the book. So I'll do both the seated and the standing heel drops for most people, and myself included. And then also deadlifts, both the traditional and Romanian deadlift version, I think are great for just building up some good strength in the whole lower extremity. So those are kind of my 4 key ones that I'll do, and then depending on any other concerns, I'll add in other exercises, up around the hips or core if I think that's an issue.
Yeah. And how are you managing that at the moment, given that the gyms are all closed? I know here in Vancouver, are you managing to do that at home right now, or?
Yeah, I actually, on my list is to order an Olympic bar and some plates. Last week I cleaned out my garage, so I now have room for that. I got a little space in there, so plan is to use that to do some of those. And with that, you can do all 4 of those exercises I mentioned with just a bar and some plates to get heavy and so you don't need to have fancy equipment to be able to do it. You don't need a universal gym. You can do these very simply at home.
No, and I think in my experience, I've actually got some kettlebells, and I find those pretty versatile in terms of being able to get a good amount of load if you've got a couple of heavy kettlebells laying around, and they don't take as much room. So family aren't as frustrated with having weights laying around everywhere. So,
yeah, for sure. And you can easily add them to a backpack, right? Throw them in a backpack just to add that extra weight onto the body, and then you can do all your body weight exercises with the extra weight.
Yeah, and one of the other things I tend to say is I like actually getting runners onto single leg so that then they're not biasing things. So single leg deadlift at home with some kettlebells often is a really nice prehab exercise depending on where you are. So
yeah, and with the single leg, it's nice because you can actually you don't need as much weight because you're only doing it on one side. I always like to say that running is a single leg sport. You're never on 2 legs at the same time, so important to train that.
So we've gone through the loading and trying to develop that actual load tolerance in terms of heavy, slow resistance. Do you bring in plyometrics into that as well in your rehab? And if so, when would you normally add them in?
Yeah, so plyometrics are great for runners. They're also high risk. And so, for a lot of the runners I see in the clinic, some of them will get there with them, and others we don't quite get there. But certainly for runners who I guess are have a little bit more resiliency, who have been through a good solid strength training program and are ready to take that on, then they can be great. And certainly for healthy runners who have already gone through that strength program and can tolerate it, they're great. And so things like box jumps are really good, like things that really emphasize short ground contact time, and using that sort of storage and release mechanism of your Achilles, I think are really the ones to zero in on.
Yeah, I think I've read somewhere before that you shouldn't start depth jumps or drop jumps until you can actually squat something like 1.5 times your body weight. I'm not sure that there's that many runners out there, given our smaller frames, who can do that effectively. Or maybe they can, but they just don't have the setup to be able to really test that. So I think a lot of people maybe look for a recipe in terms of saying, right, do this number. But I don't know if you'd agree, but in my experience, it's so individual that you can't say, well, someone needs to do a set of 5 drop jumps to get them back to the point where they need to run or not. I think it's quite individual. But
yeah, I
I don't
always
know.
shy away from having sort of definitive statements like that. Like, you know, if you can do this, then you can move on to this. Because I agree, it is individual, and some people are they're just more resilient, and you can maybe kind of push things a little bit faster for them, and they'll be okay. Whereas others will just buckle under that. So you have to be really careful, I think, and really understand the person in front of you, and tailor the program to them. And you know, if you get to know someone and build up their strength program and see how they tolerate that, you'll know when it's, you know, they're ready to progress to that next level. And obviously you're going to drop the weight right back down to body weight when you start with plyometrics.
Yeah.
And start with, you know, if you're doing box jumps, you'll start with low boxes, build up. And so I think it, you know, it requires a lot of clinical judgment, clinical reasoning.
Yeah, I definitely echo that, and starting off in smaller numbers than maybe you think that you actually might need, just because those heavy eccentric loads are obviously, as you mentioned, can be a risk for people. So I just wanted to go back to some of the retraining processes. You said in your own rehab that you had increased your own cadence. If you were trying to train someone to increase their cadence, how do you go about doing that?
So the easiest way to do it is to just download a metronome app for your phone, and then you can control what you set it to. I'm usually aiming for 5 to 10% increase for most people when I'm increasing their cadence. Anything more than that can be just too difficult to attain for a lot of people. They just don't feel like they feel like they're sort of just spinning their legs, and their running economy just goes way down when they're trying to do that. So I think doing it in 5 to 10% chunks, and then you know, if they able to adapt to that, then you can, if you need to, you can push it a bit further beyond that. But downloading a metronome app, and then the difficulty when you're trying to increase your cadence, if you're running outside, is that some people just run faster, right? So they increase their cadence, they keep their stride length the same, and then they just run faster, which obviously makes it more difficult. So if they have access to a treadmill, I usually encourage them to try and do it on the treadmill. And I explain to them that you know, these are your physio exercises. Do your running outside of this, your regular training, but for the next 2-3 weeks, I want you to do regular runs on the treadmill that are not going to be fatiguing per se. I mean, we're looking at 15 to 30 minutes of easy pace running. But you're going to be focusing on increasing your cadence during that time, and using you know, a phased feedback program like the one that Irene Davis has popularized. I think is a good place to start, where you increase, you start with 100% feedback with that metronome, just running for about 15 minutes at a comfortable pace on the treadmill, and then you increase your running time with that up to about 30 minutes, and you start to take away the feedback during that time, so that you're running now for longer periods with less feedback. So you have to really internalize that new pattern that you're running with.
And how many sessions would you normally do that over? Does that vary between people, or do you normally find it takes a set number of sessions to achieve that?
So typically I will do something like the 2-week 8-session program that Irene Davis has used. If they have access to a gym or a treadmill where they can do that quite easily. But you know, Chris Brauma's study last year, where they basically came in and they trained them on a treadmill in the clinic for 10 minutes, and then sent them off with a metronome and said, just try and keep your cadence up over the next 2 weeks, and then take away the feedback and try and maintain it after that for another 2 weeks. That was quite a successful intervention. So you know, you may not need as much sort of structure and hand holding, I guess, through it. I still like to give that because I think it keeps people on task and gives them this idea that the feedback, those sessions are sort of their physio exercises, and avoids using them as training sessions as well, which I think can be an issue, because they're trying to you know, achieve other goals during those training sessions, like speed or whatever. But I think, again, if you can try and get them access to a treadmill, you can usually do it over a couple of weeks. That doesn't mean that they're going to be comfortable at the end of 2 weeks running at that increased cadence, and they'll maintain it forever. I think they still need to focus on it after that, but then you can loosen up the structure, get them off the treadmill, get them running outside a little bit more, integrating it into their regular training.
Yeah. And do you find that I know that's actually quite hard to count whilst you're running sometimes, so to count the number of steps you're taking. Are there any of the wearables that you use to measure the cadence? Do the ones that you mentioned earlier do that very well?
Yeah, I mean, most of the GPS wristwatches now will display cadence as one of their fields, so that's usually the easiest way to do it because most people have those. You also have like RunScribe will measure cadence in real time, and you can sync that with your GPS watch. Either one of those is fine. But yeah, I would use, most people actually come in and they can show me what their cadence has been on all their runs because they can track it with their watch over time. They can show me the last 6 months, all their runs, what their cadence has been like.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And so I just wanted to take a little bit of an aside now, just moving over a little bit. I know that when we're assessing runners, a lot of people will still come in and talk to me about overpronation and whether they need to prevent that and stop doing that. What would you say about that? Do you feel that that's something that we need to try and achieve with our runners, or is that something that's sort of been refuted now?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part that overpronation paradigm has been thoroughly debunked. I think there are still cases where clinically it's relevant. If someone comes in with a tibialis posterior injury and you're seeing that they're really overpronating on that side, and maybe they're running with a bit of foot abduction and that sort of thing, and then I think that makes sense clinically, and especially if you can tie it to a change. If they've always run that way and this is the first time that they've had a problem with it, then I think you have to consider other factors like training load, changes in footwear, that sort of thing. But if it's been sort of a more recent change for whatever reason, maybe they sprained their ankle, and so they've lost some dorsiflexion, and now they're running with their foot turned out into abduction, and they're pronating more, and they've got this tibialis posterior tendon injury. Then that's a case where pronation is an issue, and you may want to. There'd be various ways you would correct that, obviously, but for the most part, I don't pay much attention to pronation in my gait assessments. And I don't look at it as something that I need to correct for preventing future injury.
So we shouldn't be dipping our feet in water and walking on paper anymore to assess our foot shape.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's it.
Okay, well, I'm glad that we could hopefully slay some of that sacred cow a little bit. The next part of that was actually, you mentioned shoes there, and I know that a lot of people may prescribe shoes based on foot shapes, or still do, based on that pronation paradigm. And I know that you were recently part of a debate here in Vancouver with some other pretty well researched guys. So Jean-Francois Esculier, Michael Ryan, guys who have sort of been involved in that sort of space for a while. What's your take on shoes and running injuries?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think, the body is pretty capable of adapting to a lot of different things, and shoes are just another thing to adapt to. Provided that you have time to adapt, that's the biggest issue. If you're trying to change your footwear, whether you're going from a traditional shoe to a minimalist shoe, or to a maximalist shoe, or anything in between, any big change like that needs time to be able to adapt to that change. And so I think, when people get injured, footwear is this kind of external thing that they can blame. It's very easy to blame the shoe. it can't be your, the way you trained, or how much sleep you're getting, or lack of strength training, that sort of thing. It's got to be the shoes, and so you change your shoes. But I think the shoes are probably, if you're making minor adjustments to your shoes, staying within the same sort of class of shoes, generally. So if you're in minimalist shoes and you stay in a minimalist shoe, or in a traditional shoe and you stay in that shoe, you're probably not getting injured because of the shoes. What I find an issue is that if you change shoes, most runners are impatient. They don't want to take the time to adjust to the new shoes. And so if you adjust too quickly, then you are going to get injured. If you go from a traditional shoe to a minimalist shoe, and you haven't strengthened your calf and Achilles, you haven't taken the time to allow those tissues to adapt to those new stresses, then you're probably going to get injured. And there's some good studies out there that have shown that even if you take 6 months to adapt to those shoes, then you're going to experience pain, most likely, through that transition process. And even in that case, people still got injured. So, I think a lot of runners aren't patient enough to do that. Increase time in shoes by 5 minutes per week. And a lot of runners don't have the luxury of having extra pairs of shoes to be able to do that, or carry them around with them and swapping them out on runs. So so the reality of the situation, I think, means that it's difficult to make those changes between shoes. But if you have the dedication and the ability to do that, I have no problem with people switching into different types of shoes, just knowing that there's a risk with that, and if they do that.
Yeah. And do you think there's any implications for being able to use the wearables that we've been able to integrate in the clinic to choose an appropriate shoe in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be, just being able to measure, currently you go into a shoe store and they'll sort of look at your static foot posture, which we know isn't really related to the dynamic foot posture. And then they maybe have a look at you run back and forth in the store. Maybe they have a treadmill, which they can look at you running on, and then kind of decide, yeah, this is the shoe for you. But I think maybe in the future what we'll see is some more wearable devices available in that process, where they can measure, if a shoe happens to reduce your impact forces, or if it changes the way you run in a positive way, quote unquote positive way, then maybe you can kind of select a shoe like that. But I mean, for now, what I usually recommend to people is find a shoe that is comfortable on your foot, and that you're going to enjoy running in, because if you don't like the shoe that you're in, even if someone's told you that's the shoe for you, you're not likely to run in it. And so I think that's probably our best guide right now.
Yeah, that's sensible. So I know that you're doing your postdoc at Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver, and that you're looking at some new wearable garments. Is there anything that's coming out anytime soon that might be of interest to our listeners or viewers that we can potentially use in the clinic, that we can wear, that's different to what's out there currently?
Yeah, I hope so. We've been developing a prototype there. So that I'm working with a group of very talented engineers and computer scientists, and we've developed a prototype pair of running tights that can measure hip, knee, and ankle kinematics. And we're now in the process of integrating IMUs into those tights as well, so they can get some more kinetic information. But yeah, the goal is to be able to use these tights to be able to measure running mechanics in the field. So they'll be available hopefully for runners to be able to use when they go on runs for the trails, and running on a treadmill or on the roads, and be able to upload and track that data over time. And we're also looking at how those metrics are affected by fatigue and different terrain and that sort of thing. So that's the goal. And I think, again, there may be a sort of clinician version of those tights that we can also use where the clinician can use it much like I talked about earlier, like where they can have a runner sort of go for a number of runs, maybe with different instructions on each run, and be able to measure what happens on those runs using these tights.
Exciting times.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting. So I wanted to just dial back because I noticed that we'd had a couple of questions come in when you talked about increasing cadence and increasing it often by sort of 10% or more. Someone asked the question, why do we do that? You know, is there an ideal number? Do you want to just go into that a little bit more about what numbers we might be aiming at, and when you consider something to be below a certain threshold or pathological in some way?
Yeah. So yeah, there isn't an ideal number per se. You know, obviously people have heard the magic number of 180 steps per minute. But there's no magic number that people need to attain. What the research has shown over and over again is that if you increase your natural cadence by about between 5 and 10%, or 5 to 8%, you see a lot of benefits within that range to things like muscle activation patterns, loading patterns on the Achilles, on the knees. So you'll see changes that we think are associated with reducing injury risk and improving running efficiency. So generally the magic number there is between 5 and 8%, 5 and 10%. Now that's obviously not going to be the case for everyone. Some people, if someone comes in and they've got a natural cadence of 185 or 190 steps per minute, then you're probably not going to aim to increase that cadence. Generally, if I am looking for a cutoff number, then, you know, someone coming in, if they're over 170 steps per minute, then I'm probably not going to try and increase their cadence unless I see a real need for it. If they're below that, though, I will probably try it and see what happens. If they're down around 150, then I think definitely we want to increase it. But if they're in that sort of 160, 170 range, then I'll play around with it and see what happens. But, you know, you have to use your clinical judgment, of course, when you have the patient in front of you.
And just for our audience, when you increase their cadence, what is that actually doing for the individual?
Yeah, so assuming you're maintaining the same speed, which you are on a treadmill, increasing your cadence is going to shorten your step length. And so that shortened step length is associated with reduced braking forces, reduced vertical loading rates. It will have them tend to land, if they're a strong overstrider, rear foot striker, they're more likely to land closer to their center of mass and more on their midfoot, so moving that sort of foot strike angle down. And then you'll see associated benefits with those changes in your mechanics, associated benefits in the muscle actions as well. So that's why, you know, that sort of 5 to 10% magic number is what we aim for.
Yeah. And talking of magic numbers, someone mentioned on Twitter this morning, with everyone suddenly taking up running, that everyone needed to remember the 10% rule. So I wondered whether you could just touch on that a little bit, and whether there is such a thing as a 10% rule in running, or whether that exists or not. Yeah,
10% rule. You know, I think there's some good studies by Rasmus Nielsen's group on that, and they found I think the magic number was closer to 30%. But I think, again, it really depends on percentage of what. I mean, if you're going from 0 and building up, then you have to be really slow and cautious early on, because the thing about running that's different than a lot of activities is the impact. and your body takes time to get used to that impact and that rate of loading. And so I think if you're starting off from nothing, you have to go very slowly, and doing some sort of a walk run program is the best way to do that. If you're just increasing your mileage and you have a bit of a base behind you already, if you run 30K a week and you want to go up to 50K a week, then you can maybe increase that at a faster rate, and more like 25% per week, as opposed to the 10% goals. I think it really depends on what you're building off of more than anything.
Yeah, no, that sounds interesting. Definitely, I definitely would agree in terms of you're going to get people who maybe do a 100-meter sprint, and therefore going from a 100-meter sprint to a 10K jog, this in terms of actual overall distance, it's a much greater than 10% increase. But in terms of the actual loading rates, there might be actually more similar. We don't know, and that's why I sort of think some of the wearable research that you're doing is really interesting, because we might be able to quantify much better how speed times distance times braking force and all those sort of things correlate together.
Looping back to how we quantify that load, I think going back to what we were talking about earlier with quantifying some external measure, whether it's minutes or kilometers or miles, with a session RP internal load measure, I think is really important too, because your body's going to tell you how you're responding to that external load. And that's really what that internal load measure is. So if you're, increasing that external load too quickly, you're going to find that your internal load is going up as well. And so if you can track those measures together, and the easiest way I tell people to do that is multiply the minutes of your run by a session RP on a scale of 1 to 10. That gives you a number, and track that number over time. And again, we don't know if it's 10% is acceptable or 30%, but at least you can kind of track it that way, and be wary of having any big spikes.
Yeah, I think we've definitely killed a few different paradigms here in terms of not worrying so much about overpronation, ignoring the 10% rule, but definitely being a little bit more objective in terms of what you can measure and things. So the other thing I was going to just delve into quickly, I know that you were meant to go to the Olympics this year, and I wondered how things maybe differ between what you do in the clinic and what you sort of tend to do when you're away with some of the athletes.
Yeah, a lot of what you do goes out the window when you're doing that. You're first of all, you're dealing with outliers by nature, right? These runners are not in that normal bell curve. They're at the extremes, so you have to keep that in mind. What maybe works for the 95% of the population is not going to work for them. But the other thing is that you're really tuning for high performance. And so instead of the recreational runner who just wants to stay active and keep running and isn't necessarily worried about making national teams, you've got a runner here now who is going for maybe this is their only crack at the Olympics, and they're only going to have this one race, and it doesn't matter to them if they end up finishing fifth or 30th, right? Or maybe they're not concerned so much about the injury risk potential as the chance at having a good performance. So you change your goals a little bit, and often you're also dealing with athletes at that level in those situations where they should be healthy for the most part because they're there. And you're really trying to manage them psychologically, tell them they're good to go, everything's looking great. You do a bunch of tests that they're used to getting done in the clinic, tell them everything's looking great, and off you go, right? It's about boosting their morale and their ego and making sure that they're ready to go. So not necessarily the same approach that you would do in the clinic, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the fact that you said that they should be healthy, even though we've worked out that most of them are sometimes some of the sickest people on earth, given the amount of concoctions they're on. But yeah, so I just wanted to wrap up there because we've obviously taken enough of your time. I know that you've got 2 kids and you need to get back to make sure they're not going to come and interrupt us. So I'm going to hand back over to Claire, but I just wanted to say thanks for taking the time to have a chat today.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thanks for a terrific discussion today, Chris and Paul. It's a privilege for us to have 2 really accomplished runners and physiotherapists on to discuss what I think are really common concerns in the clinic and also can be challenging for us. You've inspired me to go back and do some plyometrics. I'm definitely not sharing my marathon time with anyone, but suffice to say that I won't be outpacing either of you in the near future, so you're safe. Chris and Paul, actually, before we finish up a fun finishing for today, do you have a favourite music or podcast that you like to listen to while you run, or is it silence?
Silence for me.
Paul?
Oh no, I'm definitely a podcast man. I'm looking forward to the JOSPT podcast starting out. Obviously, I have to give a shout out to BJSM as well because I do listen to some of those when I'm out. But I think from a running point of view, I listen to Run Chat Live. So I'll give those guys a bit of a shout out as well. And I don't know if Chris, if you've been on there before, but I know that they get a lot of good running researchers on there. So I'll give them a shout out as well.
Yeah,
nice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely like to run with silence. I like to pay attention to my running and the environment when I run. But I do have my favorite podcasts and yeah, Run Chat Live is a good one. BGSM for sure. And then also I also love listening to Malcolm Gladwell, so I like his Revisionist History podcast.
Some great tips there. Thank you very much.